Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be returning to an issue we cover often here, and that is the state of the state. Our guest tonight is Ralph Martire, the Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Ralph, welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on, Kevin. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Great. I'm tired, old, and cranky. Let's make a match out of that somehow.
Yeah. I think our state is tired, old, and cranky. Things certainly aren't going very well. It's kind of creaky in the state.
It's not really cranky. It's fiscally unsound. And I think, tax policy, budget policy, something people really don't like to talk about. The numbers are huge, but it's pretty common sense. If you don't have adequate resources on the front end, you won't get adequate outcomes on the back end. And that's what the public sector is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be delivering adequate outcomes in our communities. It's supposed to be educating our kids. It's supposed to be providing access to crucial services for vulnerable populations. Can't do any of that stuff if it doesn't have adequate resources. And the problem with Illinois for decades is the tax policy hasn't worked, and that has led to innumerable problems on the service delivery side of the ledger.
So tax policy is made, of course, by politicians. The elected officials in Springfield set the policy. Why is it that we have this serious disconnect in Illinois that's so much worse than other states? Every state has a legislature. Every state elects their local politicians. Why do we have that disconnect here?
Illinois has always historically been a very low tax state, and we're pretty moderate from an ideological standpoint, both in the Democratic and Republican Party for the most part. So we've been a moderate, relatively conservative, low tax state. Now, years ago, that was probably okay because the Illinois economy was way ahead of the rest of the nation. We had a lot of manufacturing, and we generated enough revenue based on our strong economy to sort of skip by. And the economy has changed, tax policy has not, and the demands on our revenue system have grown, and we've just never gotten to the point where we've fixed tax policy, where it's modern, where it's sustainable, where it treats taxpayers fairly. And that's created an ongoing structural deficit at the state level. So literally, revenue growth, if you just adjust for inflation and changes in population, you assume a normal economy, won't keep pace with service cost growth from one year to another, once again, just adjusting for inflation. So every year you get a little deficit and it gets worse, and then rather than raise taxes, because politically that's a very difficult thing to do, irresponsible fiscal practices are engaged in, like borrowing, for instance, against a pension contribution and using that money to fund services, and then someday down the road you have to pay that pension debt. Oh, that day is now.
Yes,
we're supposed to be paying it back. And so getting the tax policy wrong has some very negative consequences. And I think the shining area of that in Illinois is public education. We have the 5th largest economy and the 5th largest population of any state in the nation. We rank 42nd in education funding per kid, 42nd. And even worse than that, when you look at the state level, the portion of education funding, the money that comes from the state as opposed from local resources, we rank 50th. We are dead last in the nation in the portion of school funding that comes from the state, only 28%. Which means the vast majority, in our case over 62%, comes from local property taxes. That would be number 1 in the country. So Illinois has effectively tied the quality of public education a child is going to receive in our state to the property wealth of which the community in which the kid lives. So if a kid lives in a property wealthy community, gets a world-class education in Illinois, if not, and I mean even middle-income community, pretty struggling. And then the lower you go down the income ladder, the worse the education gets.
So this is structurally regressive, right?
Very.
And those who have the least get the least because of the structure of the taxation system, right?
Right.
So why is this not a source of outrage amongst people?
Well, because once again, it goes back to dealing with tax policy. So let's think about it. Where resources are least, needs are greatest. So whatever you do with tax policy, you have to tax them that have a little bit more, and you have to take that revenue and spend it where needs are greatest, where resources are least. Now in Illinois, since we're a very low tax state overall, and we rely, for instance, on local property taxes as the primary vehicle for funding public education, we've created a political situation where it's virtually impossible to deal with tax policy. If you happen to be fortunate enough to be upper income in Illinois, you have low taxes, and great schools. If you are lower middle income in Illinois, you have high taxes and poor schools. So now when Springfield decision makers try talking about increasing taxes for whatever reason, low and middle income folks say, wait a minute, we're paying a lot already,
Yeah.
and we're not getting much. The folks at top are saying, why should I pay any more? I've got a nice low tax burden and I've got great schools. So you've literally got a caustic political environment around tax policy that would require a lot of leadership to overcome. And I'll give this to Governor Quinn. I mean, a lot of people, say that, he's a little wishy-washy or this or that. On tax policy, he's been pretty consistent that we need a little bit more revenue in the system if we're going to even maintain our current investment in public education. So he's been willing to tell voters what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. And I think that takes some courage, and I'll give him credit for that. Now, have we agreed with every proposal he's put on the table? No, but I think it's at least good that he's out there saying, wait a minute, we do have to deal with the revenue side of the ledger. It's not about wasteful spending or any of this other stuff.
Now, how about his opponent? Bruce Rauner is running and has his own tax plan for the state.
Well, yeah, it's not. I mean, we've reviewed his fiscal policy proposal for the state of Illinois, and really the bottom line is there's not quite enough substance there for it to raise to the level of smoke and mirrors. So
raise above the level of smoke and mirrors?
Not even to
no,
that
not
level.
to that level.
So
Gotcha.
I mean, the problem is he talks about how he's going to create jobs by simply cutting taxes.
But is there any evidence that
Yet there
happens?
is no evidence that happens. In fact, every peer-reviewed piece of independent research, whether it was done by the Congressional Budget Office or the Small Business Association, or even you go down to the university level, University of Missouri did a thorough all of them conclude just the opposite, that in fact there's no correlation at all between your tax policy and job growth. It's interesting, the Congressional Budget Office said, at the end of the day, what encourages businesses to hire more people is when demand for their product or service goes up. Huh, what a radical finding.
Yeah.
But tax policy is really not a driver there. And if you look at sort of what's happened in our economy post the Great Recession, you could really see that using tax policy to encourage job growth, i.e. cutting the taxes of businesses and hoping that they'll take this extra money to create jobs, is really not going to work for you. Since the Great Recession ended, after you adjust for inflation, so through the recovery period, corporate profits are up at record levels, 38.5% in real terms. Our national GDP has only grown by 8% and wages are up by 5%. So corporate America is really
has done very well.
Recovered well, and is one of the reasons why we are in a recovery period rather than still in a recession. But it's been a jobless recovery. So despite the fact that businesses in general have a significant amount of profitability on the books, they're not hiring people. Because it's not about how much money you have in the books, it's whether or not people are buying your products or services, right? So if you cut their taxes and give them even more profit,
it still gets going to go to the stockholders.
So the stockholders, there's just no incentive there to create a job. I mean, that's not why a business creates a job. It's very logical stuff. So Bruce Rauner's entire fiscal proposal says, look, I'm going to cut taxes, we'll have job growth, and even though we're cutting taxes, we'll make more revenue from all these new jobs. Well,
wasn't that disproven with the Laffer curve back in the Reagan years?
It has never worked. Supply side economics, we've now had a 30-year test period with it at the national level, and it certainly has not worked. And in fact, I'll put some numbers on that, and then we'll get back to candidate Rauner's proposal. So when Ronald Reagan embarked on the path of supply side economics, the promises were pretty simple. If you cut taxes at the top, you'll free up so much income, so much revenue for these folks that they'll invest in creating new jobs. It'll trickle down, benefit everyone. In fact, the economy will grow at faster rates because you've freed up more income of job creators to create more jobs. And not only will the economy grow faster, but people's incomes will grow faster. And since so many people's incomes will grow so much faster, you won't have deficit problems even though you cut taxes at the top, because everyone else is going to pay so much more in taxes. Now, that's sort of the basic theory behind supply-side economics. Well, let's just test it with a little data. So from the end of World War II, 1947 through 1979, we had very high marginal tax rates on affluent people in America. They varied from 71 to 92%. during that time period, after you adjust for inflation, our economy grew, our national GDP grew in real terms by on average 3.8% per year. That was our growth. And income distribution went as follows. The wealthiest 10% over this sequence got about 34.5% of all income growth. Nice chunk. But the bottom 90% got about 65%. And in fact, it didn't matter how you sliced your income demographics, deciles, quintiles, bottom 10%, bottom 5%. Every income class in real terms saw an increase in their purchasing power and an
Real
increase,
purchasing power,
real
right.
purchasing power over time. So a rising tide was lifting all boats. But then in 1981, the top marginal tax rate at the federal level was cut from, I think it was about 78%, 76% at that time, down to 38.5 by Ronald Reagan. And then in 2001, George W. Bush, continuing, cut the top rate down to 35%. So now let's look at the period from 1980 through 2007. Let's not include the Great Recession. Great Recession was a bad time
For everyone. Right.
So, but you don't want that to throw off your numbers. You're trying to
Right.
analyze whether or not supply-side economics worked, and obviously throwing the Great Recession, it would make anything look bad.
Right.
So you don't want to include that. You want to be fair. You want to look at normal economic cycles. And so during that time period, we had this significant tax cut at the top, and the national economy grew by a full percentage point slower than it did when tax rates were higher.
Starting with Ronald Reagan.
Starting with Ronald Reagan. So over this period, on average, GDP grew by only 2.8% per year in real terms, whereas in the preceding year, when we had higher taxes at the federal level, it grew by 3.8% per year.
So that's more than a 25% reduction in GDP growth.
And right, so clearly there was no trickle down. And so because there was no trickle down, of course, we didn't have this explosion in incomes at the bottom where people were paying so much more in taxes because they were earning so much more. So deficits, of course, went way up.
Right.
And as far as income distribution, well, once again, no trickle down. So interestingly enough, after you adjust for inflation, over this same time period, the wealthiest 10% in America got 139.8% of all growth in income.
So we're
Now,
dealing with a pie of 100%, and
Right.
they got 139%.
Right, so yeah, to be very clear, for anyone who's math challenged, listening or watching the program here, 100% is all of it. So if more than all of it went to the top, that means people at the
Someone's
bottom and
losing.
middle lost. And on average, the bottom 90% actually saw their incomes decline by 39.5% over this period. So we've had a 30-year test period for supply-side economics, and it hasn't worked. And it was an interesting theory, but it just hasn't worked. Now it's being repeated by candidate Rauner. But interestingly, while he claims the tax cuts will create jobs, he really cites no authority for that in his position paper. And better yet, when you really read carefully, he never claims any specific amount of job creation will flow from his tax cuts. He's silent to that. He gives examples, for instance, on the side of if jobs were to grow by X, that would generate Y in revenue. But he never claims his tax cuts will cause job growth of X.
Right.
So it's a intelligently written paper, because if you just read through it quickly, you might think that those jobs are actually being promised by the candidate, but they are not. But more concern to us, even if Illinois got the job growth that he says is theoretically possible in this brave new world, the net impact of his proposals would be to increase the state's budget deficit by anywhere from $5 to $7 billion. Billion with a B.
That's double what it is today.
Yeah, today it's about $6.5 billion. So literally, we'd be looking at a deficit approaching 13 or 14 billion. We only spend 24 billion on public services. We'd be at a deficit level of 50%. And what we spend on, and I don't think most people understand this, 9 out of $10 in our general fund on services at the state level in Illinois go to 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. So
which one are you going to cut?
Which one you're going to cut and by how much? And interestingly enough, according to his position papers, candidate Rauner says, well, not only is he not going to cut education at all, he's going to increase funding for that. Well, that's taken a 30-year budget offline from being cut and actually for being increased. So now you've got this incredible deficit that's going to be balanced how? Cutting Medicaid to the bone eliminating social services for vulnerable populations. So let's talk about social services. People don't talk about that. Over half of our social service spending in Illinois, about 56% of it goes to two things: mental health and developmental disabilities. You get up to 3/4 of our social services expenditures when you include the Department on Aging, so caring for seniors. And the final 25% of our expenditures on social is everything else state government provides to vulnerable populations. So it's the whole budget for DCFS, caring for abused and neglected children. It's domestic violence. It's child care for single working parents. It's substance abuse. It's AIDS, all that stuff. What are we going to do? Just stop funding everything there?
And even that wouldn't be enough.
Even that wouldn't be enough. We could eliminate all social services, and we would still have a deficit of about $6 or $7 billion. And then what are you going to do? Stop having state police? I mean, really, the options aren't clear as to what would really happen. So when you dig through candidate Rauner's proposal, it doesn't appear to be one that's viable, and it certainly is math challenge.
So what can be done? The picture seems bleak because, as you have described, the public willingness to accept the idea of taxes is limited at best. But clearly, even maintaining the status quo is going to create bigger and bigger deficits.
Yeah,
in the future.
we're gonna have so. I think what we need is honestly, my group is bipartisan. I do think you need a bipartisan leadership here. You need people in both the Democratic and Republican Party to step to the plate and say, you know what, these services are valuable. And I know folks don't like paying for it, but if we reform taxes the right way and shift some tax burden from low and middle income families to upper income families, and raised adequate revenue to fund schools the right way so we didn't have these great disparities and inequities in our public education system, and every child received a meaningful educational opportunity from their school. If we did that, if we really provided those services that allow vulnerable populations, people with disabilities, people with mental health concerns to lead a life that has just a bare level of decent quality. If we did all these things, we'd still be relatively low tax, and our economy would go well. And I think the way I look at this, it's a lot like your mortgage payment. I mean, I don't like to pay my mortgages. I don't like to pay my tax. I just don't. With my mortgage, though, I'm willing to pay it because I really like sleeping indoors. So I get the value of that. And I think the problem with taxes is most people don't understand what the state spends on. They don't get that it spends on education, health, social services, and public safety. And I know that from the polling data because all of those service areas receive significantly high support from the general public when they're asked as to whether or not they should be cut. In fact, in every one of those service categories, well over 65% of the population says don't cut it to balance the budget.
So almost 2/3 of the people say, don't cut my program. Don't cut that because that's a bad idea.
Don't cut 90% of the budget, but solve your, in our case in Illinois, it's about a 28% deficit, so it's huge. Solve that 28% deficit by cutting spending. Well,
but 90% of it is off limits.
But 90% of it's off limit. You know, and that's because they really don't understand that's how government spends. So I think if the leadership came together on a bipartisan basis, it's never a pleasant thing to say we need to pay a little bit more in taxes. Right. But if we did it the right way, like I said, the fair way, if we shifted some tax burden right now.
Well, how would that, because there's only a few things you can do with taxes. There's income tax, property tax, sales tax, and there's some minor ones, but those are the big ones.
Well, yeah, and at the state level, take out the property tax. And in fact, what we should do is reduce our reliance on property taxes. So net, what we need to do at the state level is probably increase our income tax rate a little bit, maybe from its current level of 5%. By the way, it's about to go down to 3.75, so let's not let that happen. But even at 5%, it's low. Compared to other states, increase it to 6%.
And it's not progressive either. It's a flat tax.
It's a flat tax. We'd need a constitutional amendment to make it progressive. In a perfect world, you'd have lower rates apply to lower levels of income and higher rates apply to higher levels of income. That's textbook fair in a capitalist economy for taxation.
And how the federal IRS works.
How the federal system works, but this is not a perfect world in which we live. It is, in fact, Illinois. And so it has a constitution that prohibits us from taking the perfect course on fixing our tax policy, but you could design around it. So you raise the rate a little bit, and then you provide targeted tax relief to low and middle income families. And there's credits out there like the earned income tax credit, for instance, which is refundable. What does that mean? It means if you owe $200 in state income taxes, but you qualify for a $300 credit, well, you don't have to pay the taxes, right? Because 300 is more than 200. Leaving a balance of 100, you get a check for. And that $100 check recognizes you're paying sales taxes and property taxes and excise taxes. So it's relieving that tax burden in addition to your income tax burden, all through the income tax code. Very simple way to do it, fiscally responsible way to do it. And I should point out, it has enjoyed fantastic bipartisan support over the years. The federal earned income tax credit first passed under Richard Nixon, who greatly supported it, but the president who increased it the most was Ronald Reagan. And Reagan, in fact, described the EITC as the single best pro-job, pro-family, anti-poverty legislation Congress ever passed. So it's had great bipartisan support, it's effective, and as a tool, the EITC or another refundable tax credit for low and middle income families in Illinois that really did reduce tax burden at the bottom and middle would be a nice way to bring fairness into the system while shifting some taxes to the top where people can pay out of their growing wealth now as opposed to the growing poverty for most people after inflation.
So what's stopping us? It sounds like such a good idea. How come it's not moving forward?
Well, we have a half hour to talk about this, and neither one of us is trying to beat the other in a general election. And so I think that's why we could have this discussion. The problem is, you know, most campaigns don't have the opportunity to make this kind of a thoughtful case to people. Most politicians really don't get that chance. It's a soundbite world. Folks' jobs are very difficult these days. They're very time consuming, and you know, the in-laws are coming in this weekend, and maybe the mother-in-law's coming in on her broom, and you're really concerned about that, and the kids got soccer practice, all that other stuff. You've got 30 seconds. So in 30 seconds, the easier thing to do if you want to get reelected is say, you know what, I'm not going to raise your taxes. You're already paying too much in taxes. And in Illinois, that's going to resonate with low and middle income families very strongly because they are paying too much in taxes and they're not getting great services in return. And at the top, they don't want to pay more in taxes because they're getting great services in return for their low tax burden. So
what's it going to take? I mean, that's a bleak picture, and we don't like to think that we're doomed.
It takes people who want to govern. And I do think that there are legislators down in Springfield who can work together to accomplish this, and on both sides of the aisle.
During a non-election year, maybe?
During a non-election year, or even during an election year. Even this year, there was behind the scenes some bipartisan cooperation to try to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot to allow a progressive, graduated, fair tax structure, you know, lower rates at lower levels of income, et cetera. And it did have bipartisan support. Now, it never got to that point because the Democrats couldn't get it through with enough Democrats, and so the Republicans were, well, wait a minute, why am I going to put my neck out on that when you can't even get enough Democrats on board?
In a democratically controlled legislature.
Right. So that was the issue there, but it's promising, and you know, we take shots at Springfield, and deservedly so many times, but most legislators, when you meet them and you talk to them, are thoughtful people, both sides of the aisle. Most legislators want to do the right thing. Most legislators are concerned with their constituents, and they do have to govern. And they're looking at a budget that simply doesn't allow you to govern it. It really doesn't even allow you to provide any adequate level of services. And so I think whomever the next governor is, whether Governor Quinn gets reelected or we have the first term of a Governor Rauner, that governor is going to have an opportunity to do something very big.
And
the fiscal condition is almost forcing it, right?
Well, they have to, right? It's an unsustainable position.
It's an unsustainable position. So it's not all doom and gloom, but then again, voters and taxpayers have to understand public services, which they value, cost money to provide.
Might it take a drastic cut in public services before the average voter comes around to realize that, gee, I'm getting something for those tax dollars?
Well, you know, drastic cuts have been made. I mean, so here's the story. In the last 5 fiscal years, those 4 core service areas have been cut by $4.7 billion in nominal dollars, not even adjusting for inflation. Right now, domestic violence, for instance, there are no more domestic violence centers in Marion, Illinois. They've all been closed for budget cuts. Child care has been significantly scaled back. Mental health services have been cut dramatically. Public education. I mean, Illinois is such a laggard there by our own standards. We have something called the Education Funding Advisory Board, which has a recommended level of school funding. We are $4.5 billion below this recommended level.
Recommended by whom?
by EFAB, this education funding, which is a nonpartisan group that just looks at the cost of educating kids. We're $4.5 billion below that cost. If in the fifth richest state, in the richest nation of the world, you can't raise that $4.5 billion. It sounds like a lot of money, right?
Well, but at the state level, it's
But
not that much.
It's not that much. I got to really give you context. We have a $695 billion state GDP. We need a tax increase of about $5 billion. That's less than 1%. And that would literally solve our problems. And what you would do, you'd have to expand our sales tax base to services. You'd have to increase the income tax. Yes, we probably should tax some retirement income.
But
we
go
would
back-
suggest on people, wait a second, earning over $50,000 a year. Get that revenue in the system. And then within 2 years, pay all your past due bills, because that's the first thing you ought to do, is get to a balanced budget. You shouldn't increase your spending until, in fact, you've paid your bills. Then, in year 3, you start phasing in an increase in education funding over 4 years. You could literally get that $4.5 billion into education over 4 years and allow for thoughtful planning for that. And by year 5, we'd have a balanced budget. We'd have adequately funded public education, and we'd probably have close to $750 million to $800 million left over to start investing more in social services. Win, 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 and all for less than 1% of our economy in a cost.
Sounds like a great political platform. You can't sell that to one of the candidates?
Well, we haven't been able to thus far.
Right. So we only have a couple minutes left, but something you said struck a nerve, that taxing services. In Illinois, most services are not taxed, correct?
That is correct. So there
And
are
that's like
47 states have a sales tax. Of those 47, we have the third most narrow base because of our refusal to tax services. In fact, all of our neighboring states already tax services far more than we do.
And that's a huge portion of the GDP, right?
Well, if you look at it, so what we tax is the sale of goods. And the sale of goods right now is only about 17% of our economy. And this is down from 35% in 1965. The sale of services is over 72% of our economy, and that's what we don't tax. So it's one of the primary reasons we have this structural imbalance between revenue growth and service cost growth over time. If you just adjust for inflation, it's one of the things we have to solve. And no, it wouldn't make us Taxachusetts. Once again, it would just modernize the system and make it more sustainable. And interestingly, they already tax things like haircuts and lawn care and bowling and those sorts of things in Iowa and Wisconsin. And I don't know about you, but I've not seen busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming here to get their haircut, although I have seen their haircuts and I frankly think they should.
Sounds like a Bears fan talking about the Packers, right?
There you go.
So the average person watching this show, what should they do? I mean, this is a reasonable proposal you put forth. How do people act on it?
I think the thing to do is to visit with your legislator in district, your state reps, your state senators, and say, look, we would support you doing the right thing on tax policy. We'll be there with you. We value these services. We get that public education is important. We get that vulnerable populations do need to have some investment made so that they have some sort of quality of life, and we're willing to pay a little bit for that. Think about it like you think about your mortgage. It's not pleasant, but you value it, so you're willing to do it.
Cozy place to live. Ralph, we're already out of time. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks for
We'll
having
have
me,
you again. I
Kevin.
hope by next time you're on the show we have a little brighter picture to paint.
There you
We'll
go.
see, right?
Thanks.
So thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. We've been visiting with Ralph Martire. And if you follow his advice, you'll contact your local legislators and you'll talk about tax policy. Yes, you'll do that. So till next time, you can catch us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19 and find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So till next time, thank you and good night.